When most people hear the word ADHD, they immediately think of a brain disorder, a malfunction, something biologically wrong with a person. But that perspective misses the deeper truth. ADHD is not a disease of the brain. It's an adaptation, a survival mechanism formed in response to experiences that were overwhelming, unsafe, or painful. The brain, in its brilliance, found ways to cope. What looks like distraction is often the nervous system protecting itself from stimuli that once felt threatening. What appears as restlessness is the body's way of discharging energy it never felt safe to release in the past. Hyperfocus, something many with ADHD experience, is the mind's attempt to find safety and control in one area when everything else feels unstable. These are not random glitches. They are carefully wired strategies to endure. Think about a child who grows up in a home filled with tension, where love feels conditional, or where emotional needs are overlooked. That child quickly learns to tune out, to disappear into imagination, to find pockets of safety within their own inner world. From the outside, it looks like they can't concentrate, but in reality, their attention is serving a purpose. It's shielding them from the chaos around them. ADHD behaviors are the body and brain saying, I need to survive this moment, and this is how I know to do it. That sort of unintended. This is why calling ADHD purely a disorder misses its wisdom. It dismisses the intelligence of the human system, which is always working to protect itself, always trying to adapt. If you see ADHD as a trauma response, suddenly the narrative changes. Instead of blaming yourself for being unfocused, scattered, or impulsive, you can begin to see those behaviors as your survival code, created during times when you had no other choice. And when you shift your perspective in this way, shame begins to dissolve, because it's not that your brain is broken, it's that your brain was brilliant enough to find a way to help you endure. It was never about weakness, it was always about survival. And that realization is the beginning of understanding ADHD not as a life sentence, but as a story of resilience written into your very being. ADHD does not simply appear out of nowhere, and is not a random genetic defect. It is deeply influenced by the environment in which a child grows up. A developing brain is incredibly sensitive, and when a child is raised in conditions that are unstable, neglectful, or emotionally distant, the nervous system adapts in order to survive. These adaptations often look like the very symptoms we later call ADHD. Imagine a child living in a home where a parent is stressed, distracted, or emotionally unavailable. That child learns very quickly that their feelings are not being attuned to, that their needs are not being met with warmth or presence. In order to protect themselves from the pain of unmet needs, the child's mind may drift away, tuning out from reality. What later gets labeled as inattention is actually a coping strategy that once shielded them from disappointment and hurt. On the other side, if a child grows up in chaos, perhaps where conflict, criticism, or unpredictability dominate the household, they may develop hyper-awareness. The nervous system becomes wired to scan the environment, constantly looking for signs of threat. That vigilance, later described as restlessness or impulsivity, was originally a survival tool. It kept them prepared for the next outburst or the next wave of instability. The ADHD brain, then, is not broken. It is shaped by the need to adapt to an environment that did not feel safe or nurturing. This perspective helps explain why not every child exposed to trauma develops the same patterns. Some withdraw, others fight, and some become what we now describe as ADHD. Each adaptation is the brain's attempt to handle stress in the best way it knows how. The child's environment leaves an imprint on how their attention, energy, and emotional regulation develop. When you understand ADHD through this lens, you begin to see compassion instead of judgment. Rather than asking, what's wrong with this person? The more truthful question is, what happened to this person? What environment shaped their brain to survive this way? By shifting that focus, we recognize that ADHD is not a character flaw or laziness, but a natural response to the emotional climate of childhood. And within that understanding lies the key to healing. Because what was shaped by the environment can also be reshaped through safety, connection, and care. One of the most misunderstood aspects of ADHD is the constant need for stimulation. To many people, it looks like impatience, impulsivity, or a lack of discipline, but beneath that restlessness lies something much deeper. Trauma has taught the brain that silence is not safe. For someone who grew up in an environment filled with unpredictability, rejection, or emotional neglect, stillness often carried fear. In silence, the child might have felt abandoned, unseen, or left alone with overwhelming emotions they didn't know how to process. So the nervous system learned to escape that silence by chasing, stimulation, noise, activity, anything that could distract from the discomfort of being left with themselves. This is why so many people with ADHD describe their minds as constantly searching, jumping from one thing to another, or craving movement and novelty. It is not about a broken brain. It is about a brain that once needed distraction to feel safe. When the environment felt threatening, staying busy or occupied with external focus was a shield against the pain of what was happening inside. In other words, hyperactivity and restlessness were never flaws. They were survival patterns. The search for stimulation also explains the ADHD tendency toward hyperfocus. When a person finds something engaging enough, the brain locks on tightly, because finally there is a sense of control, a sense of safety in that moment of immersion. For a child who once had little control over the surroundings, hyperfocus becomes a refuge, a way of shutting out everything else. What may look extreme to others is actually the nervous system holding on to stability wherever it can find it. Understanding this reframes how we see ADHD behaviors. Instead of calling them reckless or lazy, we can see them as nervous system strategies to avoid the emptiness that silence once represented. The constant motion, the drive for stimulation, the restless searching, they all carry the echoes of a child who adapted to an unsafe world. And when you recognize this, you stop seeing ADHD as a character defect. You start to see a story of survival, where the very patterns that others judge are the same ones that once protected a vulnerable child from pain. But one of the deepest wounds for people with ADHD is not just the challenges of living with the symptoms, but the way those symptoms are misunderstood by the world around them. From a young age, many are told they are lazy, careless, or not living up to their potential. Teachers label them as disruptive, parents see them as defiant, and peers may treat them as unreliable. Something must be wrong with me. That narrative becomes shame, and shame becomes a heavy burden that only reinforces the very struggles they already face. What society fails to recognize is that these so-called symptoms were born from adaptation, not from weakness. A child who learned to tune out was not trying to be difficult, they were protecting themselves. A teenager who couldn't sit still was not trying to disrespect authority, they were discharging energy their nervous system didn't know how else to release. But when these behaviors are judged rather than understood, the person begins to internalize the criticism. They start to believe that their struggles are proof of failure rather than survival. This cycle of misunderstanding can be more damaging than the ADHD behaviors themselves. Because shame doesn't just stay on the surface, it seeps into identity. It convinces people they are broken, that they will never be enough, and that no amount of effort will change it. And when you believe you are broken, it is easy to give up before even trying. But when ADHD is reframed as a trauma response, the shame begins to loosen its grip. It becomes clear that what others call deficiency was in fact the nervous system's brilliance at work, finding ways to cope in environments that were unsafe or emotionally barren. The shame does not belong to the individual, it belongs to the misunderstanding. Healing begins when someone can look at themselves with compassion rather than judgment. When they can say, I wasn't broken, I was surviving. And in that realization, a new narrative is written, one where ADHD is not a life sentence of shame, but a sign of resilience that deserves to be honored. When it comes to ADHD, so much of the conversation focuses on managing symptoms, taking medication, creating routines, or learning productivity hacks. While these tools can be helpful, they only address the surface. True healing begins when we look beneath the symptoms and understand the trauma that shaped them. ADHD is not simply about distraction or impulsivity. It is the imprint of unresolved pain carried in the nervous system. Until that pain is acknowledged, the patterns will continue to repeat themselves. A person with ADHD often struggles not because they lack willpower, but because their nervous system is stuck in survival mode. The brain that once had to tune out, seek stimulation, or remain hyper-alert never learned how to feel safe in stillness. So the healing process isn't about forcing focus or punishing restlessness. It's about teaching the body and mind that it is finally safe, that requires compassion, patience, and environments that nurture instead of criticize. Therapy can play a powerful role in this process. Trauma-focused approaches allow people to reconnect with the parts of themselves that were pushed aside in childhood. Instead of fighting their tendencies, they begin to understand where they came from. That understanding alone can be profoundly healing because it replaces self-blame with self-awareness. When someone realizes, I developed these patterns because I needed them to survive, it shifts the entire narrative of who they are. Equally important is creating safety in relationships. Healing cannot happen in isolation. For someone with ADHD rooted in trauma, being with people who are present, attuned, and accepting helps rewire the nervous system. Each experience of being seen and valued builds new pathways that say, it's safe to be myself. I don't have to escape anymore. Slowly, the survival patterns lose their grip because the brain learns there is another way to exist. This is why healing ADHD is not about fixing a disorder, but about addressing the pain beneath it. It's about giving the nervous system what it never had: safety, presence, and compassion. When that foundation is rebuilt, the very traits that once felt like a burden can begin to transform into sources of strength. When society talks about ADHD, the focus is almost always on what's wrong. Lack of focus, poor impulse control, restlessness, forgetfulness. But rarely do we pause to ask what gifts are hidden inside these traits. When you step back and look through the lens of trauma, ADHD stops looking like a broken brain and starts looking like a survivor's brain. And in survival, There is creativity, resourcefulness, and strength. What others call distractibility can also be seen as an incredible ability to notice details others overlook. What they call impulsivity can be reimagined as boldness, a willingness to act when others hesitate. Hyperfocus, often framed as obsessive, can lead to deep mastery. Creativity and innovation when channeled into something meaningful. When that vision channels into something meaningful, people with ADHD are often highly intuitive, sensitive to emotional currents in a room, and deeply empathetic. This sensitivity is no accident. It is a result of growing up in environments where they had to read moods, detect shifts, and stay alert to survive. That same survival skill, when carried into adulthood, often makes them more attuned to the feelings of others and more compassionate toward pain. What was once hypervigilance can become empathy. The very traits born out of trauma can also become the foundation of resilience. Creativity thrives in those who have had to imagine new ways of coping. Problem solving becomes second nature for someone who has always had to find unconventional paths. The ability to think outside the box, to connect ideas in fresh and original ways, often comes directly from a brain wired to adapt. These are not deficits. They are hidden gifts waiting to be recognized and cultivated. The tragedy is that so many people with ADHD grow up only hearing what's wrong with them. They carry shame rather than recognizing their unique strengths. But once you understand ADHD not as a disorder, but as a story of adaptation, you begin to see the extraordinary resilience it represents. And in that recognition lies hope. What once felt like a burden can become a source of power, creativity, and contribution to the world.